right? Those consonant clusters are going to be really hard for the Cantonese speakers, just like for the Spanish speakers. So here are just some examples. Oh, let me show you. I'm going to go back one. Oh, so this is really challenging in Ukrainian. In Ukrainian, so the sounds like t and d, you know, they can change and become more kind of central sounds with the palate, depending if where they are in the position of words. So that makes it really challenging for these students to understand that. So the English sounds that are made with your lips, p, b, m, well, in Ukrainian they can be p, b, m, but they change depending where they are within. So they might do that when they're learning English. So as we apply that, so first you've got to get me to process the sounds and produce the sounds, and then I'm going to be working on manipulating sounds. And one of the things we know is when you can do this in your home language, such as Spanish, that really helps your Spanish reading. And when you can do this kind of skill in your English language, it helps your English reading. So that's how it looks within the language. But now let's look across languages. Oh my gosh, look at the correlation between Spanish and English, 0.92. If I had 1.0, that would be a perfect correlation. But you know what I'm missing? What does that 0.08 represent? Right? All of those sounds. You gotta help me, you just gotta help me. And if I'm a good Spanish reader, that's gonna likelihood that I'm gonna be a very good English reader. When I have my Spanish phonological awareness solid, that helps my English reading. When I have solid, if you've got kids in dual language, when they're really good at this in English, and I'm trying to immerse them into Spanish, it's gonna help them. So these kinds of connections are found between other languages as well, between like German and between like Russian, and it's amazing. So what I want you to do different is as follows. This is what you're going to do different on Monday. When you're working with these students, why don't you pick some targeted sounds and use that across. Make the connection between phonological awareness and phonics and reading fluency and the vocabulary. And let's do this. This is my focus on j, all right? Say the word ham, everybody. I want you to change the h to j. What did we get? Jam. Very good. You said that beautifully. Let me show you a picture of strawberry jam. Do you have that word jam? I'm going to place the jam on the toasted bread. What is jam in your home language? Jalea, mermelada. Nice work. Say the word bet. Change the b to j. What do we get now? Oh, that means airplane. Another word for airplane is jet. What is that in your home language? Avion, right? So I'm going to travel in a jet tomorrow. Say the word pig, change the p to j. The new word is jig. Maybe you were thinking of a dance. My son taught me about the jig for fishing. I learned a new word, right? And I can jig the line. Say the word hog, change the h to j. And for English learners, we like to get total physical response. We can jog in place. What did I do different here? What did I do different? What I did different is I targeted a sound, a new sound of this new language. I included those visual supports. I made a connection. I gave them what those words meant, and I gave them a connection to their home language, and I had them use in a complete sentence, no surprise there, right? So this is the process that I follow to not only work on phonemes, and I teach them why we're doing the work that we're doing. And then I apply it to phonics. Say jam. Say jog, say jet. You probably already do this. Let me write the words for you to see. Jam, jog, jet. What do you see at the beginning? The letter is J. And my new sound is j. And my key word is jaguar. Now, do you recognize this letter in your language? Yes. What do you call it? Jota. What's their sound in your language? What's that word? Jaguar. All right. So you say, we say j. That's the difference, right? And so we make those connections, we use it in a sentence, we go back, and then we're going to apply that to reading and writing. So I connected that phoneme awareness to learning that letters and sound, and then we're going to practice reading words. Now, no one ever taught me that there was 6 syllables in English, right? And the reason that would have been so helpful to me is then I would have known when to say you know, and when to say E, right? And so knowing that when that vowel follows a consonant in that syllable, I'm going to say the short sounds. And I'm not going to say meh here like I want to, right? And so here we're learning about, oh, the opposite of that is when it ends in a vowel. I'm going to say the long vowel sounds. Here this is very problematic for me because I'm going to read dame, teme, five, rope, cube, because we never have a silent E. But here I do see first grade teachers teaching this, so I'm glad about that. So we have to learn to say the long vowel sounds and not the E. Now, something you never taught me was when do I say and when do I say are, and when do I say or? And I would say for years, oh, I need a tutor. And the word was tutor. But I never knew, why is it tutor? Well, when that OR, right, tutor, when it's not in the accented syllable, tutor, then it's going to be right? Doctor, tutor. Why didn't you teach me that? And then I wouldn't have said doctor, right? And then when it is in the accented syllable, then I'm going to say or, like in corn. The same thing with R. I shouldn't be saying dollar, right? Dollar, collar, just that, right? And it's because it's not in the stressed syllable. And then that OR, you really mess me up. When that OR follows the W, then it says like in worth and worthy and worship and world. So teach me, I can learn and then I can generalize, right? So these are just, accented versus unaccented syllable. All right, that O, when the teacher says, oh, when the first, the two vowels go walking, the first one does the talking. No, less than 50% of the time. I have to learn oo and and o, and that EA can say eh like in sweater, can say A like in great, and can say E like in meat. I'm going to have a lot of practice with those, right? So you have to teach each one. And then I like to put together those final syllable types like shun and jun and chur and jur. But you got to make sure that I can pronounce it. But looky here, I want to show you something. We have the same patterns. Look, then, right? That means here, give it to me. It means something different. But it occurs, but I never had to learn it. No, means the same. Dame means give it to me, not deign, right? Pie, that's my foot, not the dessert. And mar is the beach. So even though we have these same patterns, we pronounce them differently and they have different meanings. So teach me this. And then let's practice. Oh my God, boring decoding practice. You had me do phonological awareness. I learned the letter and sound. I learned the syllable. I learned the closed syllable. And now you want me to read words. But we're going to read words, but we're going to do something different. Everyone prepare. Ready? Read the first row for me. Everyone out loud. Jam, jet, jig. Very good. Now, I want you to tell me the word, read the words. We're going to pay attention to the sounds and the letters. Read the words that not only have the sound j, but have the a after it. Ready? Read. I addressed phonology there. I'm incorporating the components of language to my reading practice. Ready? Prepare the next row. Read. Jim. Great reading. Which words are persons' names? Which word means someone's work? So I'm addressing vocabulary. Let's do the next one. Ready? Read. Jet, jig. Very nice. I want to show you something. Can you read the word, or maybe you're going to show me something that can be a noun, a person, place, or thing, can be a verb, action, and can be an adjective that describes something. What word? Jet. That's right. We talked about jet when we did phonological awareness, the airplane. We're going to jet out of here in a little bit, going to take our good break. And I have jet black hair or an inkjet printer, right? It's describing. Now let's read the next one. Ready? Just, jam, jig, jat. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the use. If I was going to say something like I was only kidding, what word could I use there? Let's use it in a sentence. I was just kidding. Ready? I'm going to blank to the music. I'm going to jam to the music. We talked about the jam, and then now we're talking about what? What are we doing when we jam to the music? What does that mean exactly? We're listening and enjoying that music. So Monday, you're going to beef up your decoding practice, and you're going to incorporate language, and especially for these students, because guess what they start doing? As they're reading, they start thinking about the sound features, the word meanings, the function, and the use. And they start thinking very metalinguistically, very deeper, and that's what we want for our students. That's what you'll do on Monday. And here's just some examples of the kind of the questions I would ask: which word begins with, which word has 2 syllables, which one starts with this sound, what words means this, what word's an anonym or synonym. So these are just some examples, all right? We'll come along. Now, when we talk about fluency, I want to warn you about something. Just because the student who's an English learner, you're getting really happy about the fluency, I'm going to tell you something. That reading fluency, right? That reading fluency and comprehension for these students is moderated by their oral language proficiency. So it's just not like just because I'm fluent, I'm going to have this great comprehension. And what we need extra is we need extra help and support in the phrasing, in the cadence of the language. And we could use pencil swings. Jim makes rings for his job. Now I know how that language works, how I might be phrasing. And you'll also see on that Elon's rubric, we have a lot about phrasing in there too. We've got to be monitoring this, but we've got to teach it. How does it work? And what's really nice when you teach syntax and you teach things like prepositions and prepositional phrases, that helps me in my phrasing of the language. And so these are the kinds of like sub-skills we work on. And then I wanted to address vocabulary, and I talked a little bit about morphological awareness, but another good word learning strategy are cognate awareness, so that when we're reading and learning words, are there some words that look familiar to me in my home language that might help me understand these new words of English? And I give you the example of canoe, right? This word looks similar in English and Catalan. It looks similar in Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, canoa, even in French and German and Ukrainian, right? So these cognates, like tell me what these words are in English. The first word is what in English? What's the next word? What's the next word? What's the next word? What's the next? What's the next one? Awesome. And here I have the Arabic translation, and the only thing I found was like maybe ductura, right? D-U-K-T-U-R-A. But for English and Spanish, that worked nicely, didn't it? But what I do here is something more explicit. So we were just talking about the word author. Can you say the word? Author. And in your language, what is the word? In my language is autor, right? And if we look at that, how many syllables did it have in English? Author, 2. How many in Spanish? Autor. I open my mouth 2 times. It's a syllable. Yep, it has 2 syllables. How many sounds in English? A-er, 3. But in Spanish, it's out, or, as 4. That O-R in Spanish is 2 sounds, right? How many meaning units? Oh, the author is someone who, what? Writes something, very good. And how can we think about the use? Can you use the word author in English as a verb? You can, but not in Spanish, you can't, right? Let's use it in a sentence, and let's look at what's the same and different in the spelling. How's it spelled different? In English, you have that H. So I just want to show you here, what does this system have? I worked on phonology, those very first 2, right? I asked about the sounds and the syllables. I worked on the meaning. What does it mean? I worked on the morphology, right? I had them work on the grammatical function, and I had them use it, and I even extended into spelling. So right there in that routine, I went through the components of language, and I added also orthography. And guess what happens? The students start to think about it. What's the same in the sounds, the meanings, the structure, the use? Same thing with morphology. Say bicycle, say bilingual, bifocals. What did you hear at the beginning? You heard bi. Very good. My bicycle has how many wheels? My bifocals have how many lenses? 2. Very good. If you're bilingual, you can speak how many languages? Very nice. So what is the meaning of bi? Let's think of some other words with bi. If I do something twice a year, what would that be? If I live in a home that has 2 cultures, that would be what? Bicultural. If I have something that's 2 colors, like my jacket has 3. My hair has 2 colors, right? Gray. Gray's in there. All right. So that means two. Now we're going to be reading a story that has a bunch of words that have this prefix, and I'm going to take advantage of you knowing that. But when I know about English and know, oh, in English, I see we have OR and ER, but when we think about Latin, in Latin we use OR, professor, doctor, right? But in the Old English, English came about these Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, and they were farmers and fishermen, right? And hunters, and so words like farmer and worker and fisherman, right? Those ER comes from that. And they mean the same. And the Greeks gave us a lot of words too. So 15% of our English language comes from the Greek. And so whenever you have the CHs, that's Greek. The French, when we talk about chartreuse, there's no champagne here today, right? But if it's Latin-based, it's going to be CI and SI and TI. That's going to be a Latin-based word, right? And lastly, one of the things we want to see, and I'm going to end with this today, and these are the evidence-based practices that come from the National Reading Panel, National Literacy Panels. And as we look at this, we think about the strategies that we need for comprehension. But I want to think about, using multiple strategies, but doing so in a very consistent manner. And so when they talk about, using, graphic organizers and semantic organizers and knowing about the text structure and using that cooperative learning. And so I came up with 3PV, 3RQ, and this is my lesson plan that I use for how I'm going to make sure that I'm bringing in those evidence-based practices. And I start with the purpose because it tells me, first of all, the purpose of what they're doing. And by the way, I've been watching lots of classrooms, and they do all this stuff, and no one ever tells the children, what's the purpose of what we're doing? What are we going to be learning here today? What's the purpose of it? Even when you do phonological awareness, what's the purpose of this? Because I just see kids going blah, 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 and they have no idea what they're doing or why they're doing it. What is it connected to, right? But the same thing for reading. What's the purpose of what we're going to read? Well, we're going to be reading words, and guess what? They also have that prefix by that we were talking about. And we're also going to we've been talking about school and going back to school. And so let's get ready to read this. But first, I want to know about their background knowledge and what I need to front load them with. So how do you prepare for school? What languages do you speak in the classroom? What are some different ways? So again, getting to that discourse, getting that discussion, but all the while I'm adding to that prior knowledge. And then we can predict, if I even look at, the subheadings, or, just this morning when Julie was doing that this morning, we had that title about the neighborhood, right? We would have, kind of known what that passage was going to be about. So let's look at the title. The title is Lucy's Brother. What would you predict this title is about? From the title, and we're going to, so the title will be Artisans, but we'll go through that. And let's look at some vocabulary. Remember, we talked about some words with bi, and this one we're going to have bilingual. But there's other words that we talked about that all had this, and that meaning was what? The meaning was to, right? And here's some examples. Can we talk about what do you see there? The soccer ball, can you tell me the colors that you see, right? What about the bicycle? How many wheels does it have? Now let's get ready to read. And this is a story about what? They'll read Lucy's little brother. Josh is going to start preschool, but it talks about Josh going to school, being in a bilingual classroom, and the mom buying some supplies for them, and they're getting ready for that. So then we provide. So in one of our studies, we left out the retell because we were trying to save time, because we didn't want to, we wanted to shorten the lesson. And what happened in the next generation of the studies is we didn't get as great as results as had we left in that retell, because what does that retell do? We're modeling for them how we summarize with some scaffolds here, but what that retell does, it really helps them to work on their language, to get the gist of what they're reading. And so we needed to have left that in and not taken it out. And we talk about the questions, and you saw Julie this morning, giving you the types of questions, and some of the questions are right there, and some of them you had to make some inferences, right? And so when we're asking questions like who's Lucy Brothers, that was right there, what type of classroom, all of it was there. but we want to have them generate. And so when we're talking about question generation, that's what we're asking them to do. And I often do the question generation. How I do that is I ask the students, can you begin with how or why? And that also makes us do a lot of inferencing. So the students know that when we're doing this, they're going to have to think of a how or why questions, like, why did Lucy's mom suggest that riding the bike to school was not the best option for Josh? Why did she say that? Why do you think that? Can you make some inferences about that? Again, getting to their background knowledge. Oh, that could be dangerous, little kid riding the bicycle, not really, a safe method, that kind of thing. And then the other thing I want to tell you about, even in middle school classrooms, here's the deal. In math classrooms, in science classrooms, in social studies classrooms, and in language arts classrooms. What did we do? We added books and we added read-alouds related to what they were learning. And you think that's crazy to do a read-aloud, right, to kids. But guess what? We got, and you'll see in those IES practice guides, we got very nice results. And those results are because it gives an opportunity to extend their knowledge of what they're learning, to expand that vocabulary and language, to go beyond what's on their page of their textbook that they're learning about. And it just provided a lot of context for them. And so those read-alouds, that's what we included, and we're also doing this work now in high school classrooms. And then looking across, I can even look across syntactically, in the syntax manner, what's the same, what's different, and I write about this. And then I end with thinking about why do we want to be culturally and linguistically responsive? Why is that important? Well, first of all, I wish that my language and culture had been recognized as a young girl. And instead, we were punished for speaking our home language in the classroom and in the playground and in physical education. And the way they punished us was by using wooden paddles, and we would get whack, whack, whack for speaking our language. And our families were told, don't speak to them in their home language, only speak to them in English. So I wish that we had been of the mindset being culturally and linguistically responsive, and for it to have been seen as an asset. And so what did I spend? I was a very quiet child, if you could believe that. I hardly spoke during those years, but in middle school, it was really fantastic. Because in middle school, you could take Spanish as a foreign language, and I could really ace that and show them all that I knew, right? And I continued that all throughout my high school years and even in my undergraduate years. And then I went to go and study in Spain. I studied linguistics. Why? For myself, not for anything else. And my mother's a Spaniard, my father's a Mexican. When I came back from Spain, my father was like really upset at the dialect that I had, and he's like, no, you're going to Mexico now, right? And so I have to, like my dad, I speak one way, my mom another way, but all of that services, I think about that opportunity and how it really changed my life and how I get to do the work that I do today because of my love of language and my opportunity to, study the different forms of language and the different dialects. And what's really interesting is I don't belong in Mexico, I don't belong in Spain, I'm here in the United States, and you still don't feel this sense of total belonging. And so what I say here is we want our students to feel like they belong, right? And we want them to see themselves as an asset, right? It's an asset to speak another language, and that we're going to celebrate them, their language and their culture. And we're going to use that every day. So in closing, we know that we want you to be knowledgeable. We want you to do not business as usual. I want you on Monday to take what I've discussed here today with you and take it to heart and make the connection with the students and no matter the language, I gave you some websites that you can make those connections, because then you really do know your student and you honor them and you respect them like they honor and respect you. So consider these language goals as you're working on literacy. Consider them all across science, math, social studies, language arts, and use those cross-linguistic features as an asset, and be always mindful of their backgrounds and their linguistic nature. Thank you so much. And it's 12:15. I saw those signs, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 10 minutes. Thank you. So now what do? We go for a break, is that right? Thank you. You want to tell them? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Not keep you from lunch much longer, but I just have a couple of things to remind you. Number one, please make sure that you're writing down any questions or comments for Dr. Cardenas-Hagan and for Dr. Walter and Dr. Washington, who will be our afternoon speaker. We will have time to ask some questions during this afternoon's Q&A. Virtual attendees, your second attendance code is in the chat, and it will be displaying shortly. Please make sure you write that down. I wanted to point out that in your program, you have a couple of things. Dr. Cardenas-Hagan spoke about structured literacy, and I think Dr. Walter also did. We've got two infographics that are towards the back of your program. These come from our website. Again, you can see the website on the back of the program. We have these and other infographics and ebooks and other resources for parents and educators on our website, so please check that out. I also wanted to alert you to the very back cover. We've got a donate page. As you know, thanks to our generous sponsors and to the Tom and Elizabeth Fox Endowment, we are able to offer this fantastic 2-day conference for free. We also rely on the generous support of donors. So if you feel called, please either follow the QR code or follow the directions on this back cover page to donate. Any amount helps. And speaking of donations, we welcome you to take one of the tumblers that are out there on the table by the registration desk. They are for you to take. We are asking for a small donation. Any amount is appreciated, but they're not for sale, so you can feel free to take one. So just know that that's an option. We are going to resume at 1:15. Again, we need to start promptly so that we stay on schedule. So please be back here by 1:15. You don't need to go off campus. We have 5 restaurants open downstairs in the atrium, so enjoy your lunch, and thank you so much. Hello. We're going to go ahead and get started with our afternoon. I apologize, we're a few minutes late. That's on me. Good job, everybody getting seated at 1:15. So I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Sorry, I'm a little out of breath. I was running up the stairs. So welcome back to our afternoon. If you will look in your program on page 21, you will see Dr. Julie Washington's bio. She is going to be talking to us about approaching reading with a strength-based lens, using language diversity to support literacy learning. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Washington, but I encourage you to read more. Dr. Julie Washington is a professor in the School of Education at UC Irvine. She is a speech-language pathologist and is a fellow of the American Speech-Language Hearing Association. Dr. Washington directs the California Learning Disabilities Research Innovation Hub at UCI. She is also director of the Language Variation, Poverty, and Academic Success Lab. Her research is focused on the intersection of literacy, language variation, and poverty in African American children from preschool through 5th grades. In particular, her work focuses on understanding the role of cultural dialect in assessment outcomes, identification of reading disabilities in school-aged African American children, and on disentangling the relationship between language production and comprehension and the development of early reading and language skills for children growing up in poverty. Dr. Washington is currently working on the development of assessment protocols for use with high-density dialect speakers that are designed to improve our ability to measure their linguistic competence. This work is funded by the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders of the National Institutes of Health. I ended up reading the whole thing because I just couldn't stop. It was so impressive. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Washington to the stage.
Hello. I am happy to be here, and I have to tell you, I had Nashville hot chicken for lunch. My lips are numb. It was so good. But I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about some issues that are near and dear to my heart and continue the speech-language pathology show. We're all speech pathologists, we realized this morning. So I'm very interested in language variation, and so I always start with definitions so that we have a shared understanding about what I'm talking about. So language variation, also called dialects, and we started using the term language variation more in the last few years. One of the things that happens with terminology is it starts to take on a life of its own. And sometimes the terminology becomes associated with negative characteristics, and then we change it. And one of the things about dialects is that they're often not highly regarded. People tend to think of them as being divergences from language and not always positive divergences. And yet what we're really talking about is language variation, different ways of using a language. And Elsa talked about bilingualism and multilingualism. That's language variation across languages. What we're talking about is variation within languages. And so that's what dialects and language variation are in the way that I'm talking about it. So dialects are a variety of a language spoken by members of a community who are united by typically race, ethnicity, and geographic region. So we are in Tennessee. One of the varieties that is spoken here is Southern English, and the Tennessee version of Southern English. So there is Southern English, and then within Southern English, there's other kinds of Southern Englishes. And there's Chicano English, which I see more and more now that I'm in California. African American English is what I'll be talking about today, and then there's Appalachian English. So these are some of the varieties that we hear people speak depending on what race and ethnicity they are and where they live in the country. I also like to talk about what dialects are not, because there's so much stigma often attached to being a dialect speaker. Some of the kinds of things Elsa talked about, we certainly see for kids who use varieties of English. And what dialects are rule-governed variations of the language that they come from. And that's very important. This is not random things that people are doing. All dialects have rules for how they are used, when they are used, and with whom they are used. And I'll be talking about African American English, and that's certainly true for that. It comes from a major language. One of the things I think that's important for us to be aware of is that everywhere in the world there's language variety. Where there are languages, there are dialects of that language. The more languages there are, the more dialects you encounter. And so this is true everywhere in the world. And interestingly, in most places in the world, they're responded to the same way they are here. What they're not is, it's not bad grammar. They are not bad reproductions of the major language. They are different from the major language. One of the things we tend, Dr. Odegaard and I were talking about this last night, that I think in this country and many countries, we tend to pathologize differences. So anything that's different is often perceived as not being a good thing. But it's not a pathology. It is the way that people use language within their own community. It's not slang, it's not incorrect, it's not undesirable. It comes from the community you grew up in, the family you grew up in, and the way that you use language together. Dialects impact all domains of language. We don't always talk about all of them, like African American English. We call it a morphosyntactic dialect, which means morphology and syntax, and yet we know that if you, for example, are a teacher and you're teaching African American kids who use a language variety, you know it impacts phonology also. It also impacts semantics, the way that you think about word meanings and what they mean to you, and pragmatics, which is something we do not talk about enough. But there's so much cultural variation in the use of language in context. So how we use language, what we think is important about language. One of my really common examples that I use is what happens when African American kids often get to school. So how many people are early childhood? Any early childhood in here? A few early childhood. One of the first clashes of culture that we see for African American kids in school is the difference between direct and indirect language, okay? So I'm African American, I am super direct, very direct. You never have to wonder what I'm thinking, I will tell you, as my friends know. But that's really valued in my culture. And being indirect isn't quite as valued. And so I had a professor when I was in graduate school at the University of Michigan, go blue. You, but my professor was talking about direct and indirect language, and she said in development, when children are very young, they're very direct because they don't use language well. And so they just have to tell you what they want. They can't beat around the bush. So they say, give me a cookie. And she said, and then when they start to use language better, they say, that cookie sure smells good. And I thought, if I walked into the kitchen and said to my mother, that cookie sure smells good, she would say, girl, if you want a cookie, just ask for one. Don't be mealy-mouthed. That's that direct issue. And so we see African American kids get to school and the direct and indirect, like I have an example that I use because I saw it in a classroom. So little Jamal's running around the room and he's running around like he has a motor. And the teacher says, Jamal, I think it would be a good idea if you sat down. Well, we know what happened next. Jamal's like, I'm having a good time. I don't think it's a good idea, and he just keeps running. And so what she says about him is he doesn't follow directions, he doesn't listen, and I'm like, no, you gave him a choice. You said you thought it was a good idea, and then he thought about it, and he didn't think it was a good idea, so he kept running. What would his mother say? Sit down. Jamal, sit down. And so that difference between the direct and indirect and what it meant to him is one of the first clashes that we see. And so it's like, okay, so what do you do? Because people think being direct, if you are not from a direct culture, people say it's rude. But that's rude, it's harsh. No, it's direct. When it's rude, it's because it's rude. It's not because it's direct. And what they say in my culture is indirectness is dishonest. So when you're being super indirect, it's like, what does she want? Why doesn't she just say what she wants? She's not, I don't trust her. And so that's that clash of cultures that comes from differences in pragmatics. There are things we don't think about. And Elsa and I were discussing that we're adults, and I'm still figuring some of these things out. When I went to the University of Wisconsin, I had a colleague who was always asking me to do something. So she's like, we'd really like for you to be involved in this project. And I'm standing there thinking, I'm not interested in that project. Didn't say anything, though, because if I'm in a group of black people and somebody says, we really want to do this, and I'm thinking, I'm not interested in that, so I'm just silent. And then as an African-American person, that I'm not in, right? So then we're in a meeting the next day, and she's like, Julie and I are going to do X. And I'm like, oh, no, I don't want to do that. She said, you didn't say you didn't want to do it. I'm like, oh, well, I don't. So... So this happened about 3 times. It took me 3 times before I realized that silence is implicit agreement for her. Even though for me, silence means I'm not interested. So those are some of the pragmatic areas that we see where the culture you come from, the way you use language can really impact how you interact with others and misunderstandings that happen between people. And we see this a lot with kids and with adults. I mean, there are a few things I know I haven't figured out yet, and some I just pretend like I haven't figured out. So everyone in the United States speaks a dialect. I think this is something important to say. Some people, like if you're a Southerner and you have a Southern accent, your dialect is really identifiable. People know where you come from, maybe not the state, but they know what region of the country you're from. Other places don't seem to be quite as recognizable to people, but it doesn't mean there's not a dialect in that area. I grew up in Seattle, and so Seattle is way up in the corner in the Pacific Northwest, and the dialect in that region is called Pacific Northwest. It's a Northwestern dialect. And when I left Seattle, I was an undergrad. I went to Georgia, and I didn't think I had a dialect. No dialect, no accent, because I'm from Seattle. No, we don't have that. So I started working with this little boy. I used to tutor reading in order to make money, right? So I'm tutoring this little boy. He's like 9 years old, and he said something to me, and I said, huh? And I said something to him, and he said, huh? And we did that for about 2 weeks. Before we each kind of figured out each other's dialect. That's when I first became aware that I sounded different to him as much as he sounded different to me. And that's what happens across the country. We're always talking about English is our official language. We don't really have an official language, but English is the language that we all resonate to. But the reality is that English is spoken differently depending on who you are and where you live. And so this map shows that it's true across states, and then within some states, there are dialects that are different from just the region they're in, like Louisiana. When you go to Louisiana, they might have this regional, dialect, that Gulf region dialect, but then there's the Louisiana dialect, and there's a million of them, as far as I can tell in Louisiana. It's a very dialect-rich state. New York City has a separate dialect from the rest of the region and the rest of the state. So does Chicago, so does Boston. And so there are all these different ways of using language that are agreed upon by the people in the environment. Like, is anybody here from Wisconsin? Oh, Wisconsin. Okay, don't talk, okay? Wisconsin people don't talk. So how many people know what a bubbler is? If you're from Wisconsin, do not raise your hand. How many people from Wisconsin, you're not from Wisconsin, what's a bubbler? It's a water fountain. And so if you live in Wisconsin, it's a water fountain. When I first got to Wisconsin, I was in a parking lot, and I couldn't figure out how to get out. Don't laugh. I get lost coming from the bathroom. So I'm in this parking garage trying to figure out how to get out. And I stopped somebody and said, "Where's the ramp? Can you tell me where I can find the ramp?" And they all looked at me like something was wrong with me and said, "It's right here." And I said, "Where? I'm looking for the ramp." And they said, "You're in the ramp." And I said, "Oh." So the whole parking garage is a ramp. And I'm like, "Oh, I'm looking for the way out." And they said, "Oh, why didn't you say that?" Well, I thought I did. But so it was this, when I first moved there were all these different lexical items. And remember, that's about semantics. And so the different ways you use language, what words mean, like when you say to somebody in the South, "Bless your heart," we know you're not being nice. But if you live somewhere else, those words put together sound kind of nice. But if you live here, you know you're not being nice. She just called you an idiot. And so these are variations that we get across the country and within a country. So, oops, I think I turned it off. So when we talk about within language variation, Elsa talked about bilingualism and multilingualism. I talk about bidialectalism. That's someone who speaks two dialects. Multidialectalism is someone who speaks more than two, 3, 4, or more. The example on the slide is a student that I had when I was at Georgia State University. I've been in California. I moved during the pandemic in 2020. Before that, I was in Atlanta. And this student was born and raised in the South. She spoke Southern English, General American English, which we used to call Standard English, because she's well educated. And it is the variety of reading, education, and the media. And so she spoke that. She was also from coastal South Carolina. So she spoke Gullah. Yes, which is from the region that she grew up in. She's also African American. So she also spoke African American English. So she was multi-dialectal. 4 different dialects, but the thing that was important about them was that they signal a distinct identity and group membership. She belongs to each one of these groups. And in each one of these groups, she has an identity that's associated with it and a linguistic system that goes with it as well. And the ability to move in and out of these dialects with ease takes a lot of skill. And with exposure, most speakers will do it naturally. And that's a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. Even children who are very young can move in and out of language systems easily as long as they are exposed to them. Across the world, when we talk about language varieties, they have an impact on reading. Any language-based skill, the one we're talking about at this conference is reading. Reading, writing, spelling are all impacted by the variety of language that you use. And so it's important for us to pay attention to the ways that kids use language and the way that they use them in their culture if they're going to become proficient readers, writers, and spellers. One of the things I was telling Tim, we just had a paper accepted where we were looking at complex syntax in African American kids. And when we gave them a standardized test, they didn't do very well on it until we added dialect into the model, and then everybody scored in the normal range. And so without considering their language variation, they didn't look very good on this instrument because the instrument is delivered in a variety that they don't use every day. But when we added the one that they use, we figured out they had great skills. They just weren't given credit for them when they were taking the test. And so considering cultural language variation is really critical for understanding how kids are going to perform. One of the reasons I got interested in this is that I learned that very young in my career that teaching reading to kids and doing language-based tasks with kids whose language differs from the oral language of the classroom, whether it's bilingual or bidialectal, adds an additional layer of complexity to reading and writing. And the more dialect kids use, the more complex it is for them. And so it can impact them as much as speaking 2 languages. So I haven't used this example in a long time, although it's published now. And I learned this when I was a brand new assistant professor at the University of Michigan. And I was working with a little girl who was 4 years old, and we were doing a story retelling task where I read the story to her, then she tells the story back to me. So she's 4, so she can't read. So she has to listen to me do it, look at the pictures, and then retell the story. So the story was, Are You My Mother? How many people know that book? Teachers always know, Are You My Mother? So it's just briefly, it's a book about a baby bird that hatches from the egg, looks around, mother bird has gone out to find food. Of course, the baby can talk. So he says, Where's my mother? Then jumps out of the nest and finds different animals, objects, and people and says, Are you my mother? And then the response is, I am not your mother. I am a, whatever it is, chicken, whatever, okay? So this is the whole story with this line. Are you my mother? I'm not your mother. So I read this story to this little girl, and we're having a great time around the book. It's a great book. And so then it's her turn. So she looks at the book, she opens it, and she says, Is you my mama? I ain't none of your mama. And I did what you did, cracked up. It was so funny. And it was so much fun, and she told the whole story that way. And, you know, we had such a good time around it. I thought it was really cool. Then I went back to my office, and I thought about what she had to do in order to retell that story to me. She had to listen to it being told in a language variety that she did not speak. Then she had to recode it in her own system in order to tell the story back to me. She had to remember what it was that we were doing. Even if she's using the pictures for support, the language wasn't the same for her, and so she had to do all this work. That's when I realized how complex it was. For kids who are encountering what we think is an English-speaking child and an English-speaking book, well, if you are, or an English written book, if you are a speaker of a variety that's different than the one that's in the book, in order to get to just the text and then the meaning, it's a lot more work for you. And so this is called the mismatch hypothesis. See the year? 1969. We've been talking about this for so long. And it's this idea, this is Kenneth Johnson from 1969. He hypothesized that the mismatch between the language system that you use at home and the one that appears in text increases the cognitive load for children. It just means they have to work harder at it in order to get to reading. It doesn't mean that they won't learn to read, but it takes longer and it takes more work for them to get to what it is that we're trying to teach them. And I'm not going to talk about the next one because I don't want to get into language impairment. But when I was I feel like I've been everywhere. Now I'm at the University of Wisconsin. So I was at the University of Wisconsin, and I started working with Mark Seidenberg. And Mark builds computational models. These are theoretical models that you can use to test a question. So I said to him, we've been talking about the mismatch hypothesis since the beginning of my career, but there's some controversy around whether this actually is explanatory. Can we test it using a computational model? And he said yes. So he built this computational model, and most computational models are at the word level, not at the paragraph level. So he created this model where the spelling of words and the pronunciation of the word either matched or it didn't match. And he fed it into the model, and our goal was to see if the model responded differentially depending on whether there was a match or not. And what we learned was that when the spelling and the pronunciation matched, the model needed approximately 300 trials to get to 75% mastery, okay? So it needed like 300 instances of practice in order to master the word when the spelling and the pronunciation matched. When there was a mismatch and the spelling and pronunciation didn't match, it took the model more than 1,000 trials to get to 75% mastery. That's 3 times the amount of practice and exposure in order to master this concept when things didn't match. And so we learned from this that the mismatch hypothesis, in fact, is accurate when we're talking about these kids, and it was what we thought was happening to kids, that they're listening and it doesn't quite match what they have in their own system. And so I need more time, I need more exposure, I need more opportunity to deal with that exemplar before you move on. And so what do we do in school? We move on, whether the kids have it or not. Some of it is the absence of the awareness that the child needs more, and some of it is we feel like we need to get through this. But I want you to know that when we do that, we're leaving kids behind. And so that's what we're seeing with kids. This was a really important study. So we did a study in Georgia that is now in California called the Georgia Learning Disabilities Innovation Hub. And this was funded by the National Institutes of Health. And we tested 866 African American kids in grades 1 through 5. And our overarching question was, in a population of students for whom 8 out of 10 are having difficulty with reading, who has a reading disability? Okay? So how do we figure out who has a reading disability when almost everybody is having difficulty with reading? Do you want to know the answer? I have no idea. I wish I could tell you. We're still working on that. What we do know is that we have had to use some methods that don't involve just testing because our instruments aren't very good. When you're talking about language in particular, language instruments cannot tell the difference between poverty and disability. That's one of the things we learned. That for the language instrument, poverty and disability look the same. The fact that you have low language levels because you're impoverished does not mean you're impaired. But on a language instrument, you look the same. So we're still working that out. We have a few ideas. Elsa talked about them a little bit. What we do know is that what we end up with is misdiagnosis. Not overdiagnosis, not underdiagnosis, just the wrong diagnosis. And so we're trying to figure out how to become more accurate and develop our own instruments. We're working on that as well. So this is the population that we saw, large southeastern school district. And this is what our schools look like. So these largely African-American schools, 85 to 100% of the kids in the schools were African-Americans, so they were basically segregated by race just because of the part of the city that the kids lived in. Most school segregation issues are actually housing issues, not school issues. And so this is where students lived, going to neighborhood schools. Most of them you see in schools 1 through 4. Most of the kids in the school were receiving free lunch, so high poverty schools. The bottom 3, where about half the kids were receiving free lunch, are charter schools. So one of the things we figured out quickly was that most of the middle income African American kids in this community had left the public school, the traditional public school, and were in charter schools. So we had to go look for them. But this is what our sample looks like. And this is what we learned about their reading scores. So these are core reading subtests. We all recognize these foundational reading skills. And for those who don't know standardized testing, the mean or average on a standardized test is 100. The standard deviation is 15, which means that the range of scores from 85 to 115 are considered in the normal range. So that's typical performance on an instrument. The child who's at 85 is low normal. The child at 115 is high. And then you have a bunch of kids in the middle, okay? So when we look at these kids, what we learned about them was that they look pretty good. They look like we expect them to, on the instrument at least. The lowest score was passage comprehension, but it's still well within age expectations or grade expectations. So most means and standard deviations are close to what we expected. On average, reading skills were comparable to the standardization sample. The first time I presented this to a group, they're like, but how is that possible? Because we know how much trouble kids are having with reading, African American kids, because this is what it looked like before the pandemic. And this was before the pandemic, see, 2019. So what we see on these instruments does not match the national landscape for African American readers. We see kids doing pretty well. After the pandemic, these numbers are worse. But what we did learn from the pandemic, I don't know if I included, oh, I did. I included this table from the NAEP. the National Assessment of Education Progress, what we learned was that it was not about race. Who was hurt the most by the pandemic in terms of reading. It was about where you started before the pandemic. So those kids who were in the bottom 10th percentile before the pandemic are the ones who were hurt the most by the pandemic. Their reading got worse and worse over time. The kids at the top weren't hurt as much. So you see in the top 90th percentile, the change in their scores, they went down about 2 points. At the bottom, about 10 points, which is the biggest drop we've ever seen on the NAEP. And so this is what the pandemic did. So, you know, we have kids who just aren't reading well. When we look at the NAEP, 80% of kids are reading below basic, not reading below grade level, but reading below basic level who are African American. So why do our scores look like this? What happens when the skills need to be integrated? Because what we learned was the kids are learning the basic word level skills. We have the science of reading. We're in schools, we're teaching, the teachers have learned how to teach phonemic and phonological awareness. They've learned how to teach decoding skills, and guess what? When you teach it, kids are learning it. That's what we learned. But what we also have learned, and we're working on that now, trying to figure out how to mitigate it, is that what we have ended up with is a bunch of word callers. So kids who are able to read at the word level, but not put together connected text to make meaning. And so once you start putting the text together in sentences and paragraphs, kids are not able to talk about what things mean. And so I can hear from your brain even though you're not talking. It's the vocabulary and the background knowledge. I reject that. I absolutely reject it. And so we do have kids who don't have good vocabularies, but that doesn't mean that you can't handle connected text. Because unfortunately, the conundrum is that language and reading are reciprocal. And so you learn vocabulary how? By reading. And so it's not just that reading supports vocabulary, that vocabulary supports reading, it's also that reading supports vocabulary. So now we have kids who can read words. Their vocabularies are not always the best. They have a lot of conceptual knowledge, which is something we've been figuring out. So I might not be able to know the name of the word, but I know what that means. We see it all the time. We use the test of written language, and there's a picture where you write to the picture. And one of the things that's in the picture is a fire hydrant. And so a lot of our kids do not know the word fire hydrant. So what do they call it? A fire water holder. What is a fire hydrant? It's a fire water holder. It absolutely is. And last week we had a picture that had a crossing guard on it. And so some of the kids didn't know the phrase crossing guard. So what did they call her? A traffic stopper. What is she? She's a traffic stopper. And so what we have is kids who have conceptual knowledge, but not the name. And when you're reading, you do need the name. But if we knew that kids had conceptual knowledge, Julie Walter, in the absence of the label, wouldn't we teach vocabulary differently? Because what we're really trying to teach is the label. They have the knowledge, but not the label. And so the idea that it's just about vocabulary actually is something that I reject. I know vocabulary is important, but we give it so much importance that when kids have poor vocabularies, we blame them for not being able to read. And I never blame kids for anything. Everybody knows that about me, that if I see a pattern, I assume the pattern is about the instrument or something else, and I go out and look for the answer. I never assume it's the kids. It's just not my orientation. So what happens when skills need to be integrated? Well, this is when we start talking about dialect, because it's something we have learned is that the language variety that you use, as I showed in the example earlier with the little girl, really influences the way you relate to text. And so we figured out a long time ago when I was at the University of Michigan that dialect use occurs on a continuum, from very low use to really high use. And when you are in the South, the high is really high because you have not only the cultural dialect, but you have the regional dialect on top of it. So when I was in Georgia and you have kids who are African American, they're using the language system that they use in their home, and then they're using the one that you use in the region that they live in. And so all of a sudden we have a lot of language variation. And so what we learned was that it occurs on a continuum. We talk about the degree or rate of dialect use. That's what dialect density is. And dialect density impacts literacy outcomes. So what we find is that higher dialect use is related to slower growth in literacy. It does not mean you won't read. It does mean what we saw in that computational model, that you need more time. You need more exposure. You need more opportunity to engage with text in order to move along with reading. We did a study a long time ago with one of my postdocs where she used the phonological awareness test. And it's one of those tests where it looks at, your knowledge of sounds in the initial, medial, and final position and other types of awareness. And what we learned from that when we gave it to African American kindergartners was that if you tested the word in the final position of words, if you tested the phoneme in the final position, everybody got it wrong. Why? Because African American speakers delete final consonants. And so it took them longer to learn phonological awareness in the final consonant, in the final position of words. But if we did it in the initial and medial position, everybody could do it. So it meant that what it showed us was that that's another one of those instances where you have to take the cultural language variation into account before you start doing assessments. How is this dialect going to impact the way that kids are perceiving and aware of sounds? And when we stepped back from that, what we saw was that by the time the kids got to first grade, all of them could do it in the final position, but they needed an extra year to figure it out. And so they were fine the next year. So higher dialect density is slower, and the Paranik et al. 2020 article is about writing. So we see the same pattern in reading and writing, that the more dialect you use, the slower your growth. So we saw that density of dialect predicts, does this work? It does. So when this bottom axis, this is the diagnostic evaluation of language variation. It's a standardized test of language variation. And this axis is the test of language development sentence processing. And what we see is that the more dialect you use, the more likely your scores are below this reference line and they're lower. So even when you're listening to sentences, we see that your ability to comprehend those sentences is impacted by how much dialect you use, because they're probably very different from what you're doing. They call it linguistic distance in linguistics. The more dialect you use, the more distance there is between the reference sentence and the way that you are using language. The same thing is true on reading assessments. This is a passage comprehension subtest of the Woodcock-Johnson. This is the same kind of data, so the delve is down here at the bottom. Can you see it on that one when I do it over here? Oh, good. Magic. So this is language variation, and this is grade 1 through 5. And we see the same pattern. And so the way that some people have interpreted this is, well, they need to learn to code switch. We have got to teach them to use the language of the classroom. And that's the way we talked about things a few years ago. We're not talking about it that way anymore, because one of the things that we learned was that the strongest language system that any child has is the one they bring from home. It's the one they think in. It's the one they have facility with. And when we're trying to teach language-based skills like spelling, reading, and writing, and we remove your strongest language system and force you to abandon it and then learn to do these really hard things in a system that you don't actually use, we're really handicapping you. And so that's not something we really encourage anymore. Instead, I'm going to talk about translanguaging, which is the way we're talking about things now. So this is one more study where we looked at reading comprehension. I don't know, how many people know the Great Oral Reading Test? A few people. I like the gray. It introduces a level of complexity because it's oral, but we wanted to hear what the kids are doing. What are you doing when you read? So on the Gort, you read aloud. And this is the way it's structured. So like any test, it just keeps getting harder and harder. The vocabulary gets harder, sentence structure gets harder, and they get longer and longer. So longer and more complex. We scored the passages twice. So most people are familiar with miscue analysis. When you read a word differently than it appears on the page, it's treated like an error and scored as a miscue. So we scored them as miscues, and then we went back and looked at the miscues to see how much of the miscues were actually dialect. And so how many kids were actually changing the text so that it looks more like dialect. We were also interested in self-corrections for their relationship to AAE, because a lot of kids, when they are learning to use General American English, will start saying something in dialect, stop themselves and self-correct, and change it to General American English. And we wanted to know how much they were doing that. I always talk about how many people I love football. Everybody knows this. So how many people like football? Good. You know who Emmitt Smith is? Of course you do. So when Emmitt Smith left football, he became an announcer on ESPN. Then he got fired, okay? So one of the things Emmitt was doing was he wasn't speaking very fluently. And I think that really impacted his job. He was always like correcting. If you listen carefully, like speech pathologists do, what he was doing was code switching. He would start saying something in dialect, and then he would correct it on air. So he didn't sound very fluent, and that's a problem when you're an announcer. And I don't understand why he was doing it. If Charles Barkley can be an announcer, you don't have to correct anything, because Charles isn't worried about what he sounds like. And so, but when I realized that this was true for Emmitt Smith, because when he left the show, they did like a blooper reel where they showed him, you know, as an announcer, and they kept showing all the self-correction. It was kind of mean, actually, but they thought it was funny. So he would be talking, and then he would back up and restate, back up and restate. Those are self-corrections. And what he was doing, he had like this hyper-awareness that he needed to be using like, you know, formal, proper speech, and it wasn't his natural way of using language. And so he kept correcting. And I don't know that he was doing it consciously, but it was something that he was doing because somewhere in his subconscious, he thought that that's what he needed to do, and I think it cost him his job. So that's why self-corrections are informative. What are kids doing with self-corrections? And a lot of times, they are trying to move toward the standard. We still see that a lot. Last week, I was at a homeless school in Atlanta, and we saw kids doing it, like correcting themselves and correcting us. You get to a certain age, you start correcting the grown-ups. So these were our results. These are General American English passages. 92% of kids use AAE while they're reading General American English. So when they're reading out loud, we hear dialect. And guess what? So are their parents. When we have African American parents reading to kids and you are a dialect speaker, even if the word is on the page and you say in your oral language, this a red car, you will also read it that way. And so we know that there's not a one-to-one relationship between what's on the page and kids are doing, and it's true of their parents also. Is that a problem? I don't think so. But anyway, 92% of kids were doing this. Of the 1,740 variations that we saw, 21% of them could be called AAE. So these are the miscues that were scored two ways. And the other thing we saw was a low negative correlation between the use of dialect and accuracy and rate. So what we could see that kids were doing was making decisions while they were reading. And so there was a trade-off with accuracy and rate. As the use of AAE increased, rate and accuracy decreased because kids tried to slow down and do it differently. The problem with that is you get scored for rate and accuracy on this test, and so it impacted their scores and made the scores lower. And so what we learned was that African American English is produced while reading General American English text aloud. Some kids tried to improve accuracy with the trade-off with rate, but they could only do it in the easy passages. That's one of the things we learned too. So when the passages are really easy, at the beginning of the test, we saw kids really slow down and try to make sure they read every word on the page. But as it got harder, it took too much effort because you have to make these trade-offs cognitively about what you are able to attend to when you're reading. So when we got to this penultimate paragraph, the one where the next one is going to end because you're basically at the end of your reading level, we saw kids use so much dialect because now I cannot be focused on accuracy. I need to be trying to understand this passage and pronounce these words. And so what we saw was like this cognitive trade-off that kids were making. And as it got harder, there was a lot of dialect. So then what happens when you ask the questions at the end? Because remember, this is passage comprehension. So you've been doing all this work, using all your cognitive energy to try to get through this passage and translate it, because you're not four, like the little girl who was listening to Are You My Mother? She makes no effort to do that, which I was glad about. And instead, she's just into the story. But now you're older, and you've been in school long enough, and you know that you should be using using language in this more formal way. So they used up all their resources trying to read the passage. Then when you ask the questions, the answers are all wrong. And that's what we see happening when we do comprehension testing. That if you have to use your cognitive resources to try just to get through the language of the passage, you will not get the meaning from the passage. I did testing one day with this. I still test kids. You heard me say I was there last week. But I like to stay close to what I'm doing. Otherwise, I become irrelevant and start doing stuff you don't care about. So I won't do that. So I was with this little boy, and the passage was about an eagle. And every time he got to the word eagle, he said something else. And I was like, this is not going to end well. And so when it was over and I asked a question about an eagle, his answer was there was no eagle in that passage. And my thought was, baby, that's what the passage was about. But he was like not getting the meaning as he was reading because he was so focused on the structure. And so that's what we see when kids use a lot of language variation. If it's just a little bit, we don't see that. But those kids who are using a lot of variation, we're starting to talk about them more like we talk about bilingual kids, where they just have so much more work to do, and the strategies that we use with our bilingual learners actually will work well with these kids also. So, African American speakers do poorly on these language and reading assessments, but one of the things we know is that when you spend all your effort trying to perform on the test, we never really find out what you know, because all we know is your performance. So in my lab, we are really focused on performance versus competence. This is an old idea from psychology. What you do versus what you actually know. And the way we assess African American kids and many other kids who are using a lot of variety in their language doesn't usually tell us what they know. It tells us what they can do on that instrument, and we've got to change that. We're working on changing that and trying to develop some instruments that do not disadvantage kids for the way they use language, because that is not the point. When we're doing syntactic processing, we're not interested in whether you can code switch. We're interested in how long your sentences are and how well you understand language. But if we're testing you in a language that you don't know, then what we learn is how well you do when you're tested in a language you don't know, not how much you actually know about language. And so that's something we're really, really trying to change. Our dense dialect users are the ones who are burdened with a significantly higher cognitive load because of that linguistic distance issue. So far away from the way they use language when they're reading. So we talk about cognitive load theory, And I'm not going to go through it a lot, except just to like bring you along with me. And when we talk about the intrinsic load of whatever a task is, it's just the inherent complexity. How hard is this passage? How easy is the passage overall? You know, when we do research, we use and write these consent forms for parents. We have to put them into a program to figure out what grade level they are, because most Americans are reading at approximately a fifth to sixth grade level. Did you know that? That when you get a book at the airport, it's written in a fifth or sixth grade level, because that's where most people's reading level stops. And so that is the inherent complexity, and that's just how hard it is. And we can influence how hard or easy things are. We talk about scaffolding, we can do that. And then there's the extraneous load. That's what we're concerned about. It's that load that distracts kids from learning what you're trying to teach them. So if I'm so focused on the structure of the language, am I really learning how to read? Am I really learning how to understand what I read? If I'm so focused on trying to get from one system to the other. I consider that an extraneous load because it does not aid learning. All it does is pull kids' resources away from what it is we're trying to teach. And so that's what we're trying to change, the extraneous load. I love this graphic because that's our kids in the middle. The extraneous load, so tired, so like I can't do this, it's too hard. And it's not because they can't do the task, it's because the task is presented in a way that uses their resources for something that you probably didn't intend for it to be. We're working with 4th through 6th graders now in Oakland. I was telling Elsa this earlier. The sad thing for us is that the 4th graders are like, I love coming here, this is so much fun. The 6th graders are like, I'm not doing this. I have done this 3 times. I'm not interested in you people. And they are like very, very resistant after so many years of failing at reading and having people come in and do yet another reading program. They are challenging us. And so we have to figure out how to meet the challenge with them because they do need the reading help, okay? But this is what we want. We want that germane load where like this little, I don't know what he is, a piece of bubble gum. Is he a brain? I thought he was bubble gum because he's pink. Maybe I just want bubble gum. So the germane load, you know, the brain is happy, and so's the gum. So the direction we're moving in is talking about translanguaging. It's an alternative to code switching. And the thing that makes the most sense to us is that it helps kids to make sense of information in the way that they need to. And so the big thing is bidialectal students are allowed to use their entire linguistic repertoire, the full linguistic repertoire to solve problems, to read. So we don't have kids coming into the classroom and we're slapping them down and saying, you don't do it that way. You don't say it that way. It's interesting to me that, when I talk about translanguaging and allowing kids to use their own linguistic system to solve problems, people are like, but that's not the way you use language. And oh my God, they're not going to learn to use language. But we're willing to do it with spelling. Invented spelling. So you can write words and we get to see what your phonemic awareness looks like. And it encourages you to write because we're not focused on whether it's correct or not. That's exactly what we're talking about with reading, where kids are coming in, they are using their language, they're using it to support what they're doing, and often it's oral language that they're using to support. And when kids come into classroom and we tell them to be quiet, we're really not allowing them to use their oral language. That's what we're doing in our intervention now. Leading with language. We want you to talk. We want you to talk about what you're doing, because one of the things that we've learned is that many kids, and especially our kids, talk their way through things. And they talk it out, and they figure it out. And we saw that when I was at Georgia State. We had this project, the one that I talked about, where when we did the coding and needed for things to be counted, speech pathologists are not accurate. Sorry, my people. Not accurate. Neither are our education students. So we went and got the accounting students and brought them in because they don't make mistakes. So they were our coders. And most of the accounting students were Chinese. And so we're sitting, I'm sitting there and I'm explaining what we're doing, and this is what we're doing, and I'm getting this, what the hell is she talking about? And so we had one of the young ladies who had been working with us for a while. She said, let me tell them. And she turned around, she gave them the instructions in Chinese, and they all turned to me and said, now we get it. And so it was this thing about, in order to get it, that she needed to use, and it's not because they don't speak English, they do. They're enrolled in a school in Georgia. They both speak right English, and they do it fluently. But in order to figure out a new, more difficult problem that they had not encountered before, they needed to do it in their own language first. Okay? When I was in South Africa, I used to go to this rural county in South Africa, and we would do this summer camp where kids were we were focused on oral language. So kids were giving speeches, right? So you get up, you give a speech, you use all the things we taught you where you are not throwing your hands around like me, and you are scanning the room. And so we had a competition at the end. It's like, okay, whoever can do this and do it flawlessly wins a prize. So the kids were really eager. So the first little girl who got up was about 11 years old. She stood up, she put her hands in front of her, and she went, and then she looked at me and said, can I do it in my language first? And I said, absolutely. She did the whole thing in Sepedi first, and then she said, now I'm ready to do it in English, and she did it flawlessly. Because she worked it out in her own system first, and then she did it in her L2, which was English in their classroom. And so this was something, I was like, I wish I had a camera. But it was this thing where it was like, I need to be able to do this first because it's hard, and then I can do it for you in the language you're asking me to. It was amazing. And so translanguaging, I like this graphic too. It's from the International School of the Hog, where it shows translanguaging is something that they've been using in bilingualism for a long time around the world. And we're just starting to talk about it a lot more in this country. And this is the first attempt to use it with bidialectal kids and not just bilingual kids. And so, you see the little person going from their mother tongue language, whatever that is, dialect language, to the new language, and they need to bridge the two of them. And the thing that I'm here to say about not teaching code switching is that this is the work of the child. It's not your work. It's their work. To come to school, the language of the school, this is how I use it, and this is because we're within language. And the child is the one who's figuring out how to pull these things together, just like we saw this little girl do. They're figuring out how to pull these things together. For many kids, they will encounter General American English for the first time in a classroom, not used very much in their homes, especially impoverished kids, in an environment where they don't get out of this area a lot, so we're not hearing it a lot. But then so I know this language really well, because I learned it from my mother, my grandmother, my pastor, my community. Now I'm in school. Okay, now you're using it a different way, and I need to figure out how to use it this way in this context. It doesn't mean the teacher can't support, but what we don't want is to suppress. What we're trying to do is have kids come to school with the language that they use, and what we're doing as teachers is extending it to include the language of school. We're going to have you use the language that you use, your entire repertoire, and then we're going to extend it to include what we need for you to know. We wrote an article last year in The Reading Teacher on teaching phonemic and phonological awareness to African American kids, and the vignette that we used was from one of my students. She's my doctoral student now, and she's taught reading for 30 years and then decided she wanted a PhD. God bless her. But she gave this example of this child that she was working with who was African American, and she said something talking about a passage where one of the words was gold. And the child, who was 6, said, Miss Carla, do you mean goal like at the end of the rainbow or goal like in football? But remember, we delete final consonants, so the two words sounded exactly the same. And that's the day that Miss Carla realized, oh, when you say it the same way, you also perceive it the same way. And if the kids are going to be able to distinguish them, I need to figure out which words are impacted and the final consonants are deleted so that I can integrate that into my teaching. And so what she started doing from there was when she said gold, she paired it with goal so that she knew that kids, she was teaching them the difference between the two. And her response is exactly what we want to see. It was, oh, that really influences the way kids hear words, so I wonder how many words are impacted like that, because every final consonant does not have the potential to be deleted, right? So you have to figure out, and we've written it, so it's not like you got to make it up yourself. Go get a book. And you read about it, and you figure out which sounds are impacted, and she integrated all of those into the way she taught to make sure kids were moving right along with her. Because the thing that's important about it is when you remove that final D, not only have you removed the D and it becomes goal, but there also is another word that's goal. And kids have to be able to process and distinguish the two. So she taught the two. And if you're going to integrate dialect into what you're doing, I'm like, that's exactly the way to do it. The way not to do it was another example we gave in this article, where a little boy's reading out loud. And if you live anywhere, maybe even Tennessee, but I know Georgia and Mississippi, you live on a screet, you eat strawberries, and you love scrump, okay? So SKR for STR. And so that's part of the regional dialect. So he was reading, and he was talking about the screet, and every time he said screet, the teacher stopped him and made him read it again until you get it right. What happened to him? He shut down. He didn't want to read anymore. He started out with, I'm a good reader, and I'm excited to read. By the end of that session, he shut down, and I'd be willing to bet money she never got him to do it again. So that is not the way you do it. It is not an error. It's a regional variation. And because you're teaching phonological awareness and phonemic awareness, you need for him to be able to hear STR. But if you're in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi, I promise you he's not the only one in the class saying screet and scrump. And so you make it a classroom-wide teaching opportunity. And so the kids are doing most of the work themselves, but when you encounter things where you know, especially with phonology, that I really need for them to be able to hear this, teach it. But teach it with dignity, respect, and regard for the child's home language. Because every time you tell a child, and I saw this at Georgia State in college students, where they were like so traumatized by the way that their dialect was responded to when they were kids, that when you tell a child, your English is bad, what you are saying to a child who uses a language variation is your mama can't talk, your auntie can't talk, your grandma can't talk, because that system comes from home. And this is a system that we're using at home. The first time I talked to students at Georgia State who were, they were undergrads in special ed, and I talked about African American English and what the features were and what its history was. And one of the girls, I said, then Q&A. The first girl to raise her hand to ask a question, we were on Zoom. I could see all this tension in her neck and in her forehead, and I'm like, is she a stutterer? And then I started listening to her, and I said, I see so much tension in your face. What are you doing? Because I'm direct, remember? So she said, I'm trying to make sure I say it the right way. I said, stop that. So she's using all her energy trying to show me that she can say it in the proper way instead of just giving me the message. That's too much work. Too much work for her. And in the context of reading, in the context of interacting, guess what? Kids do learn to code switch as long as they can read. In the absence of reading, we do not see code switching with kids who are really, especially low-income kids, because they learn it from reading. They learn it from reading general American English text. So not being able to read has greater consequences than just not being able to read a book. It has consequences for language development. It has consequences for speech development. So kids who can read, code switch. We see that in our literature when we look longitudinally. Kids who actually can read proficiently actually do learn the language of books. Because why? Because they read it. In the absence of that reading, we don't see that kind of transformation, though. Okay, I got 6 minutes. So the most important thing to us about translanguaging is that it should reduce the cognitive load required to read. So we're not asking students to give up. You know, Louisa Moats said, teaching reading is rocket science. If teaching reading is rocket science, then learning to read is also rocket science. It's hard. It's hard to learn to read. And some of the ways that we actually teach reading have made it a little bit harder for some kids, especially if you have a long way to go from your oral system to print. So instead, we allow kids to use the language at which they're experts, that they can think in, learn in, and use that to support them. This is one of my favorite translanguaging authors. His name is Leketi Makalela. I like to say his name, but he's a professor at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. And South Africa has 12 official languages. Yes, 12. Last year they added the 12th one, sign language, which is awesome. So it's an official language in the country. And so that means that when you're teaching, you have these students who come from the rural area where they live in villages where they have these individual language systems that develop sort of in isolation. So in any class he's in, he's teaching students with a whole bunch of different languages. So in this study, there were 6 possible languages in the classroom. He wanted the students to solve a problem, gave them a problem to solve and said, go solve the problem, and then he observed them. What he learned was that the students naturally separated themselves into language groups. So they found the other students in the group who spoke Sepedi or Zulu or whatever language it was, got together with them. They solved the problem in their home language, and then when it was time to come back to the group to talk about the answer to the problem, they did it in English because they had solved it already together in their own language. And I love his conclusion. One language was incomplete without the other. And that's what I'm saying, and that's what Elsa's saying. One language is incomplete without the other. Students have to be allowed to use the language that they have strength in to support language-based skills like reading. So we're asking teachers to be accommodating. And we recognize that dialect actually might serve even if you think, oh my God, like my mother used to say, we don't talk like that, we use the Queen's English. I'm like, really? And then I got older and braver and said, the only person who speaks the Queen's English is the Queen. Everybody else uses whatever system is used in their own community. And so recognize and accept that being able to use dialect might actually be beneficial in the classroom, and it might make it easier for kids to focus on reading if they don't have to use their limited resources to try to crack the code, which is what we're asking them to do now. So don't be so quick to eliminate home languages or to correct examples. It's a deficit perspective that makes kids feel bad about the way they use language. We're not hitting kids now, I hope, like they did with Elsa, but even if we're not doing it with something physical, we're doing it with the way we treat them, the way we talk to them, and the way we respond to their use of language. It's just as harmful. So we do recognize, though, that kids need to use their own language varieties, but they also need to learn General American English. We do recognize that, because beyond this, they need to be able to use it in many different environments. So they do have to learn it, and most kids learn it no matter what we do, okay? This is the project we're doing now. I'm not going to talk about it because I'm out of time, but it's an intervention project that we're doing with 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, and we're allowing language to lead. They all have, in order to participate in the project, they have to have those skills we saw on that table. So they have to be able to read words. Everybody has the foundational skills. Now we're going to take the things you know about oral language and we're going to let them lead you to reading. And it has been amazing. And so African American kids, the reason we did this was I believe that every teacher in this room knows that language and reading are related, but no kids do. We know they're related, but the kids didn't know it was related. I'm like, yeah, reading and writing are language on paper. So the way you talk, as smart-mouthed as you are, you should be reading. And so when we encountered these kids, we're like, you're so creative with language, why can't you read? And so when we started making the connection, and we started with, like, when you talk about fluency, reading with feeling. Well, let's talk with feeling. African American English is all about rhythm and pitch and intonation and all this. And so let's apply that when you read. And so the kids were like, the first child we did it with said, I didn't know that's what reading was supposed to sound like. I'm like, yeah, it sounds like the way you talk. And we used to play this game when I was a kid where intonation. I'm a natural speech pathologist, just like you were. I always loved language. But we used to do like, right? So, yeah, exactly. Depends on how you say it, what it means. And so that's what we're trying to teach kids, that the way that you use intonation, it signals meaning. So if I say, what does that mean? It means yes, and then I say, then it's like, I don't believe anything that came out of your mouth. And the kids know it, and that's what should happen when you're reading. So we talk about how to deliver a message and then how to take that delivery and apply it to the way you read text. And the more you understand it, the more you're able to, like, confirm that delivery. And so we use those characteristics in reading. And reading is a written form of talking, so dialect is expected and never discouraged. Never, ever discouraged. And the things that the kids say to me that make me want to cry is, I love coming here because you let me talk. Yes. I like this because we talk all the time. A second grader told me that last week. I love coming here and talking to you. My teacher doesn't let me talk. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's all we do up here is talk. So in our lessons, we use translanguaging to help kids make meaning of text, because now we're no longer trying to teach you to code. All you need to be in this project is a second grade reading level. And these kids are 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, so they do have it. They can read the words. We use culturally relatable text. And that means topics that kids are interested in. It means structure that they're interested in, too. I have some hypotheses about structure, that it's not just about browning up the book or blacking up the book so that there's black people in it and somebody with a name like yours. It's more about the topics. It's more about the structure. And the kids love it. Like, these girls came in last week talking about black girl magic, and they were doing all this. And yeah, and when we talk, we like to do this. Then they started reading Hidden Figures. And in the middle of the first chapter, one of the girls stopped and said, hey, this is black girl magic. I'm like, yay! So she made the connection between the things we were talking about, the things we were reading about. We have rituals and routines that help kids know, when I come in, I do it this way, I can talk, I can do this, and I'm getting meaning from it. And unless you're in 6th grade, you're also very motivated about it. The 6th graders are hiding on the playground, but we're working on that. So we are using oral fluency to teach reading fluency. We are using talking to make the connection to books. And I really believe, I know how important language is, but it's important in both directions. Oral language is the foundation of literacy, and literacy pushes oral language. If you don't read, it impacts your vocabulary. Mary Ellen McDonald at the University of Wisconsin demonstrated if you don't read, it impacts your complex syntax, because your books have more complex structure than we use when we talk. So she looked at relative clauses like I know the boy who goes to school, and she found that when she looked at examples of adult talk and then looked at books, that relative clauses appeared 3 times more often in text than we ever heard them in oral language. So a lot of this complex sentence structure that kids need to know in order to be good readers, they're getting from reading. So you get vocabulary from reading, you get sentence structure from reading. You don't read, you don't get it. And so encouraging kids to use their strengths to learn how to do this hard new thing is not that hard for us, but it can make all the difference in whether they become readers. So our guiding principle is lead with language, that it is possible to help kids learn the classroom language variety without having negative messages about their home variety. We need to balance the need to respect kids, we know that, and their home language, while we're also helping them gain facility with classroom language. And some of it you can do by talking, right? And kids are capable of doing this work by themselves. I cannot stress this enough. If we support and scaffold instead of suppressing their strongest language system. So that's my story, and I hope you believe it. Do I have 10 minutes? All right. Any questions? Yeah, I do. I kept looking for the green card, and when I didn't see it, I thought either she gave up or I actually have time. I see you.
Is there hope that standardized testing will improve to better test students? And are test creators aware of the subjective nature of their questions that they consider objective? In your opinion?
That's a really good question. In my opinion, no. I do think standardized tests can get better. And in fact, the work that we're doing, there's no reason to recreate the wheel. We know what language skills are important to test. It's how we're testing them that's the issue. So what we're doing in Atlanta, actually, is taking traditional psycholinguistic assessments. We are administering them to African American kids and listening to how they respond. And the responses that we get, that we're getting a lot from kids, we are going to include in the list of appropriate responses on those instruments, so that it doesn't require the kids to switch language systems. But we recognize that if we're studying complex syntax, which is at the clausal level and the phrase level, then the fact that you delete is or say was instead of were is not the point. It's the idea that you can create a complex phrase or clause, and if you're doing that, the words and the language use around the clause are not the point. So we're trying to make it more valid with kids. And so, yes, I think it can be made better, but we have to be aware. What we can't do is the response we've had in the past. So I know some of our language tests have these supplemental instructions. So if you are testing an African American English speaker or a bilingual child and they do these things, give them credit for it. And so you're not penalizing them for using dialect. The problem with that is deletion of the copula, which I've used it a couple of times. This is a red car, or this is hot. In African American English can be this a red car, this hot. That's also true in language impairment, okay? So there's overlap in the way language impairment looks and the way dialect is used. And so when you give kids credit for things that they didn't do, then you may actually be masking a language impairment. So I do not recommend that. I don't recommend it at all. Instead, we need to develop better instruments and not be trying to use. That's what Lucy Calkins tried to do, was to take the old thing and make it look new. And that's what we're trying to do with our instruments, and it's not going to work. We have to develop better instruments. Even if we use the same kinds of language models that we use to develop the original ones, we need to develop something different. And so that's what we're working on. And I do believe it can get better. I really do. We have a great test for bilingual speakers, the BESA. It's a very good test. And so we need to do some of the same things for within language variation. Because language tests are bad. They're worse than reading tests. Yes.
Somebody asking a question over there? No? Okay, we have a question from an online
Okay.
participant. Is the speaker asking for dialectal, did I say that correctly? Dialectal variation.
Very good.
Thank you. To be used across the disciplines and for there not to be a quote standard.
That's a good question. My students are asking for that at the university to remove that standard. I think we're a long way away from that. What I'm really asking is that specifically, especially at these ages where kids are trying to learn how to do hard things, not to be focused on that. In the same way that we allow variation in spelling, we need to allow variation in language use also while kids are trying to master tasks. Because at least at this young age, you have kids who are using the language of home at school, and when you try to teach them something, they're fairly cooperative. Get to middle school, and they reject it completely and want to use what they use because it is a group membership issue and an identity issue. But at these young ages, we're really trying to get kids to learn to read. And if what you're doing doesn't directly impact your ability to read, then don't do it. It's extraneous. Let the kids learn to read. Am I trying to get rid of a standard personally? No. Why? No reason. I think a lot of people are trying to get rid of that standard. I'm at a school at UCI in California where it is both a Hispanic serving and an Asian serving institution. So we have a lot of students who come from other countries and communities where they use English differently. And even when they're Einstein brilliant, we penalize them because the sentence is not grammatical. And they want to know why that's an issue. If I am an engineer and I'm writing and the ideas are correct, can you teach me how to write the sentence without penalizing me for it in the admissions process? And that's a good question. It's a very good question. So am I suggesting that we do away with the standard? Not yet. Talk to me in 5 years. Well, hopefully I'll be retired in 5 years. But talk to me at some point. But no, that's not what I'm calling for. What I'm actually calling for is allowing kids to do what they need to do with language in order to master the skills that we're trying to teach them and not have them be focused on things that actually don't contribute to reading. Because when you are focused on forcing kids to code switch, that does not improve reading. In fact, it slows it down. And so if you are not doing that and just allow kids to read, when you read, your language changes anyway. The fact that we're not teaching reading is contributing to the reason that kids actually aren't learning the standard. Where would they learn it from? So much of language is learned from reading. We learn vocabulary from reading. We learn complex syntax from reading. We also learn the written standard from reading. But if we can't teach kids to read, they will not learn the written standard. So let it go and let the kids read. That's what I'm asking. Am I allowed to call on people? The lady with her hand up.
If I have a regional dialect, I'm from New England, and I find myself saying the word, many words I say differently than they say here in Tennessee. I work with English language learners, and I'm always conflicted of if I should teach them the standard way of speaking, which is like how they say aunt here, which is aunt, or, I mean, this is just one example. There's several words that I say differently, and in teaching students, I don't know best practice. Should I teach them both ways to say it? Because I can't really.
Does it influence your ability to understand what they're saying?
I
That's interesting because that's a regional variant. And so you're in the South, and if they say aunt, then you need to say aunt. No, not force them to say aunt. I say aunt because I'm from Seattle, but down here it's aunt. And so,
Tell them that it's said both ways.
why? For what reason? It depends on what the reason is.
So because I'm teaching English language learners and I'm exposing them to these vocabulary words.
So when there's a variant like that, Elsa, if aunt and aunt are both,
Well, an English language learner is more likely to say aunt, because it's closer to what they have, right?
yeah,
So, you know what, I would expect,
it's just a regional variant.
yeah, I would expect them to be closer to you than that. But once again, we honor what they have. That is one, yeah, that's one way, and it means this. And when I said it, I'm meaning that, right? And if you see, I mean, we're there to serve the children, right? So if this is the way they're gonna get it, then this is the way I'm going to teach it. And I'm not judging you that you say aunt, and you're not gonna judge me if I say aunt, right? But we have to understand that we mean the same thing.
And you could say, there are two ways to say that. There's aunt and there's aunt. There's aunt and there's aunt. But if it doesn't impact meaning, there's probably no reason to make that difference because it